Alongside the 11th century developments in trade, the expansion of towns, and centralization of power within the church we covered last lesson, monarchs also began to accumulate more and more power and control. As I mentioned when discussing feudalism, in theory, the king was all-powerful, but in actuality, he had little say regarding what really happened in his realm because of the inability to project power into local regions. In fact, many nobles had more power than kings, and repeated invasions and wars made kings more dependent on their soldiers, thus the nobility. Over the course of the 11th through 13th centuries, however, some kings, notably in England and France, were able to expand their power. In Spain, the Empire, and Italy, though, fragmentation and decentralization would reign supreme. In Spain until the 15th century, and the Empire in Italy until the 19th century. Last lesson, we covered the investiture controversy, which pitted the emperor against the pope, but also caused some internal discord within the empire when some German nobles accepted the pope's excommunication and broke with Henry. The nobles of the German Empire held quite a bit of authority in respect to the emperor. Much of the reason for this is that the Holy Roman Empire was an elective office. Emperors were elected by the German nobility. Most of the time, it ought to be noted, these nobles respected dynastic continuity and chose the son of the reigning emperor as his successor. However, in order to guarantee such succession, emperors negotiated with the nobility and generally allowed the nobility to govern on their own within their fiefs. So long as this persisted, emperors would have a difficult time trying to create a centralized state. The Concordat of Worms diminished, but did not end strife between the emperor and pope. One of the key areas of strife had to do with northern Italy. Although I've talked about the empire as a German state, the empire technically included the Italian territories north of Rome. The cities of northern Italy were not interested in being governed by a distant German emperor. In this, they were similar to the German nobility. These northern Italian cities often appealed to the pope for help in resisting any attempt by the emperor to assert control over them. The greatest attempts to bring the Italian cities firmly into imperial control were made by the Hohenstaufen family of Holy Roman emperors. The first great Hohenstaufen emperor was Frederick I Barbarossa. Barbarossa was a nickname derived from his red beard. Barbarossa invaded Italy to assert his authority, but was defeated by an alliance of northern Italian cities known as the Lombard League at the Battle of Legnano in 1176. Frederick II succeeded in subduing Italy and even added Sicily to the empire. His success proved his undoing, however, because the German nobles refused to elect his infant son as emperor after him. This led to the Great Interregnum. Interregnum means a period between the kings, and refers to this period when there was no emperor. While several imperial candidates fought amongst each other, the German nobility further expanded their control over their own territories. While the Hohenstaufens meddled in Italian politics, two groups developed in Italy over the proper response to the imperial invasion. These two quasi-political parties would dominate Italian politics from the 12th through the 14th centuries. They were named after the Italian words used to describe two German families fighting over the imperial crown, the Welf and Waiblingen families. The Waiblingen are the same as the Hohenstaufens. When spoken in Italian, these became the Guelph and the Ghibelline. The Guelphs generally supported the Pope, while the Ghibellines supported the Emperor. After the defeat of Frederick II, the Emperor had no real shot of retaking these Italian cities, but the names of the parties persisted, largely in the sense of whether someone supported or opposed the Pope's role in northern Italy. Eventually, the Great Interregnum ended with the election of Rudolf I of Austria, who was a member of the Habsburg family. From this point on, most emperors would be members of the Habsburg family. These Habsburgs became popular largely because they contented themselves with ruling over their own estates and allowed Italy and the German nobles to rule themselves. The Habsburgs did attempt to add the Swiss lands to their holdings, but the Swiss resisted by forming a loose confederation for defense. These independent cities were each known as a canton and formed the core of what would become Switzerland. As we have seen in the tempestuous history of the empire, electing an emperor could be difficult. In 1056, the Emperor Charles IV of Luxembourg issued the Golden Bull in an attempt to ease imperial successions. In particular, Charles was interested in keeping the Pope out of imperial elections, much like the Pope wanted the Emperor out of papal elections. To that end, the Golden Bull established 7 electors. The men holding these 7 offices would be the only ones who could vote in the next emperor, and a majority was needed to confirm that election. 4 of them were noblemen, the rulers of Bohemia, Brandenburg, Saxony, and the Rhineland-Palatinate. The other 3 were archbishops, over Cologne, Mainz, and Trier. As mentioned in a previous lesson, Anglo-Saxon England was a heptarchy under the kings of Wessex, who united the country under their rule. The most important king of Wessex was Alfred the Great, who led the Anglo-Saxons against the Viking invaders. At the time, Wessex was a relatively advanced state. They had a nationwide tax system, which was designed to raise funds to fight the Vikings. The Anglo-Saxons also had established a workable balance between central and local government. The Anglo-Saxon kingdom was divided into shires, or counties, each of which was overseen by a royal officer known as a shire reeve. Our word sheriff is derived from shire reeve. This office connected local with national government. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms would collapse in the 11th century, twice. The first conquest was by the Vikings, called the Danes by the English. King Canute ruled Norway and Denmark, and he conquered England as well. After Canute's death, this empire collapsed, and the Anglo-Saxons retook power. Edward the Confessor ruled as an Anglo-Saxon king until his death without an heir in 1066. This led to a 3-way struggle for the throne. Harold Godwinson was an Anglo-Saxon nobleman. Harold Hardrada was the king of Norway and the champion of the Danes. William, Duke of Normandy, had the worst claim, but he did have a promise that he would be able to become king after Edward the Confessor. Both Harold Hardrada and William invaded England. Harold Hardrada was defeated by the Anglo-Saxons under Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. But these Anglo-Saxons were subsequently defeated by William and his Normans at the Battle of Hastings. William would afterwards be known as William the Conqueror. In addition to being a great warrior, William was a great administrator. He adopted the Anglo-Saxon shire system and superimposed Norman feudalism on top of it. This government would prove to be powerfully centralized and efficient. Perhaps the most significant element of William's reign was his systematic property inventory undertaken for tax purposes, known as the Domesday Book. None of William the Conqueror's sons had sons of their own, which led to a civil war when both William's granddaughter Matilda, the daughter of William's son Henry, and William's grandson Stephen, the son of William's daughter Adela, claimed the throne. In any event, England descended into chaos until 1154, when Stephen died, and England accepted Matilda's son as King Henry II. During Henry's reign, England became an empire, gaining huge territories in France. This empire is known both as the Plantagenet and the Angevin dynasty. Henry inherited the county of Anjou and the duchy of Normandy, in addition to being King of England. He would then marry Eleanor of Aquitaine and acquire that large French territory. During his reign, he invaded Ireland and forced Wales and Scotland to accept his dominion. This empire endured beyond Henry for centuries, and is a great example of how marriages could be used to cobble together empires. It also shows the difficulties inherent in feudalism, because while Henry was King of England, he was also the Duke of Normandy and Aquitaine, and the Count of Anjou, among other titles. These were all fiefs that owed fealty to the King of France, and Henry was forced to do homage to the King of France for these lands. This is a paradox, because Henry ruled more land in France than the King of France. Henry was a true administrative successor to William the Conqueror. He was particularly effective in advancing judicial reform. Henry introduced common law to England, with juries and traveling circuit judges. He tried to eliminate separate church courts, but was unable to do so. He was particularly offended by the fact that if a priest was accused of a crime, he was tried in a church, not a state court. Henry ran into opposition from the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket. In 1170, after years of bickering, Becket was killed in a church by some of Henry's knights after they misinterpreted one of the king's outbursts. Becket was instantly acclaimed a martyr and saint, and Henry had to do public penance in compensation. He was ultimately unable to eliminate these separate courts. In his last years, Henry was beset by difficulties when his wife betrayed him and supported the rebellion of his sons. 2 of Henry's sons would rule as King of England after him. His eldest surviving son, Richard I, became known as the Lion-Hearted. He gained this nickname as a result of his adventurous military campaigns in France and Palestine. He didn't spend much of his reign in England. Another of Henry's sons, John, took power after Richard, but was a poor ruler and soldier, an especially bad circumstance considering his older brother's reputation. He was badly defeated in France, and then tried to raise money from his English subjects without consulting his nobility. This breach of feudal law led to a rebellion against him in England that resulted in the Magna Carta of 1215. The Magna Carta, Latin for Great Charter, granted a number of rights to the English nobility, especially limiting the king's power regarding the nobility. The Magna Carta did not fix the relationship between the English king and his nobility. In 1263, the English nobleman Simon de Montfort rebelled against John's son, who is now King Henry III. Henry had refused to recognize the provisions of Oxford, which were an attempt by the English nobility to force the king to appoint a council of noblemen who would help him run the country. Simon's forces captured Henry and called together representatives from English towns to discuss the future of the government. Although these members weren't elected, they are known as the First Parliament. Parliament didn't meet regularly, but only on special occasions when called, usually to approve a new tax. These first parliaments also didn't debate law, but offered advice or heard court cases. Over time, Parliament would be called more and more frequently and gain new powers. In the 14th century, it was able to pass laws, raise taxes, and impeach royal officials. It was also divided into the House of Lords and the House of Commons. You will recall that in the Treaty of Verdun, Charlemagne's empire was divided into different states, one of which evolved into the modern state of France. In 987, the last of the Carolingian kings died, and Hugh Capet, the Count of Paris, seized the throne. The dynasty he founded was known as the Capetian dynasty, and would rule France for 350 years, until 1328. Capet was not the most powerful French nobleman at the time, so it was a long, difficult process for the king to gain supremacy. Even after almost 200 years of Capetian rule, the French kings ruled only the Ile-de-France, a small region containing Paris and Orléans. The King of France, who moved the Capetians from relatively minor players to the major force in France, was Philip II, who became known as Augustus. Philip Augustus challenged the English kings who governed Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine. He fought Richard, but then clearly defeated John. Philip won the Battle of Bouvines against England, and was on the verge of invading England until Pope Innocent III forbade him from doing so. Nevertheless, Philip consolidated French rule over France, and made the Capetians the dominant power there. Philip added numerous territories to France. His grandson Louis consolidated these lands and built up the French royal bureaucracy. Like Henry II of England, Louis standardized the justice system of France. He also participated in a number of crusades, all of which failed miserably. Personally, he was deeply pious, which led to his crusading spirit. His service to France was largely motivated by his religious concerns, and he was later recognized as a saint. The last of the great Capetian monarchs was Louis's grandson Philip IV, known as the Fair. Philip's temperament was more like his namesake Philip II Augustus than his grandfather St. Louis. Like Henry II of England, Philip ran into difficulty with the church in France, but Philip's issue was the taxation of the church. At the time, as today, the church was tax-exempt, and Philip felt that they ought to contribute to his coffers. Part of the reason for his desperate need for money had to do with his constant wars against England and Flanders, which is in the modern-day Netherlands. He also eliminated the Knights Templar and seized their assets. We'll talk about the Knights Templar later. He also expelled the Jews from the country and seized their property. In addition, he debased the currency, which is a method by which coins were minted with less of a precious metal, and yet were supposed to be worth the old value. This allowed the government to create more coins with fewer metals. Philip also ordered his bureaucracy to renegotiate tax deals with various provinces of France to come up with deals that would raise more money for the crown. Perhaps the most notorious incident in his reign regarded his relationship with the Pope, Boniface VIII. During a dispute over the taxation of the clergy, Philip apparently ordered some of his soldiers to scare the Pope. The old man died shortly after the confrontation. Philip's greatest contribution to French government was his establishment of the Estates General. This was the French version of Parliament, which represented the three French estates, the clergy, the nobles, and the burghers. In particular, Philip called this body to determine whether or not his country was behind his confrontation with the Pope, a politic move that the German emperors could have used in their conflicts of the previous centuries with the Pope. As we have seen, France and England had numerous conflicts over the course of the High Middle Ages, and these coalesced into an epic struggle known as the 100 Years' War. As we have seen when discussing Kings John and Philip Augustus, France reclaimed from England most of the lands that England had previously held. The most significant territory still in English hands was Gascony in southwest France. This didn't mean that the English were willing to concede. Instead, they hoped to challenge the French again if an opportunity arose. This happened in 1328, when the last Capetian king died without a male heir. This king had a sister, Isabella, who had married the English king, and had a son with him, who was known as Edward III. This Edward, who was already king of England, claimed that he ought to be the next king of France by right of succession. The French claimed that French law prevented the passing of the crown through daughters, and another dynasty, the Valois, cousins to the last Capetians, were now kings of France. This led to an English invasion through Flanders, who was allied to England based on the wool industry commercial ties. The early years of the war, up until 1360, were English successes. In 1346, the English defeated the French at the Battle of Crécy. The English used their longbow with devastating effect on the French knights. The French were cut down before arriving at the English lines. Many consider this battle the beginning of the end of the dominance of the knight in warfare. 10 years later, the English crown heir to the throne, known as Edward the Black Prince, won the Battle of Poitiers against the French, and even captured the French king, John II. John was brought to England as a prisoner, and negotiations began on a peace. Edward's claim to the throne was not granted in the Peace of Bretigny of 1360, but the French did hand back Aquitaine, which is about a third of all of France. The peace lasted for 9 years, until the French King Charles V attacked the English and drove them almost out of Aquitaine. Charles died suddenly in 1380, however, and the sides agreed to a second truce in 1389. Both England and France dealt with internal peasant revolts in the following years, and the war became a secondary priority for everyone involved. In 1415, however, England reignited the war. Henry IV had seized the throne from his cousin Richard II and spent his remaining years consolidating control over England. His son, Henry V, thought that the best way to appeal to the English was to beat up on the French. Henry invaded northern France and won the Battle of Agincourt. Agincourt was another decisive English victory using longbows against knights. Most of the north and northwest France fell to the English and their allies, the Dukes of Burgundy. But once again the tables would be turned. In 1429, the desperate king of France, Charles VII, was inspired by the peasant girl Joan of Arc to counterattack the English. Joan was captured by the Burgundians the next year, and handed over to the English, who executed her as a witch. These actions further inspired the French. Things went from bad to worse for the English when the Burgundians abandoned their alliance in 1435. Outnumbered and outmatched, the English lost more and more territory until they could only retain the coastal city in northeast France of Calais. The war ended in 1453, a French victory. At the end of the war, a new piece of military technology was introduced that would prove important in the following centuries: the cannon.